As the saying goes, virtually every kid in the 80s was terrified of Freddy Krueger, a child-murdering psychopath who, despite being burned to death by a mob of angry parents, manages to come back as a frightening killer in people's dreams. Even growing up as a kid in the 2000s when horror movie marathon channels were common, I remember catching glimpses of Freddy Krueger's disfigured and burned look on TV, equipped with a distinct fedora and equally recognizable striped sweater, as well as his most defining feature, a claw-like glove crudely made from sharp blades. These images stayed with me for years well before I saw any of the films, and only drew me in with their creepy nature. After finally watching the movies, my fascination with the character only grew, and I instantly realized why the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise became the monolith it is today. The basic premise of the series is simple yet deeply effective. In the small suburban Ohio town of Springwood, and especially on the town's Elm Street, teenagers suffer from terrifying nightmares in which the demented Freddy Krueger constantly terrorizes them, yet if any of the teenagers happen to die in the said nightmares, they then die in real life. Inevitably, such a premise would lead to 9 movies ranging from 1984 to 2010, and would also enable the series to become universally recognized as one of the prime gold standards of the slasher horror subgenre alongside other franchises such as Friday the 13th, Halloween, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Scream. Still, while the other franchises offer a wide variety of value and scares, the original A Nightmare on Elm Street offers a fresh take on the slasher formula, and can be argued as one of the more unique and ingenious films in slasher movie and horror history as a whole. To dive further and to celebrate the film's 40th anniversary this month, it is time to examine the terrifying genius of 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street. The film begins with easily one of the most effective opening scenes in horror movie history, in which a young teenage girl aimlessly wanders around a gritty boiler room setting. Visibly frightened and chased, she paces through the nightmarish boiler room while we hear unsettling whispers. Almost immediately, we begin to see eerie close-ups of a red-burnt face staring at the tormented girl who we come to learn is named Tina. After a few minutes, Freddy ultimately corners Tina, only for Tina to wake up out of fear from the ordeal which turns out to be a nightmare. Bizarrely, though finally awake at last, Tina notices large scratch marks on her nightgown that appear to have been made from a claw-like glove. We are then introduced to Tina's friends, Nancy and Glenn, with Glenn being played by a very young Johnny Depp in his first ever film role. Though being one of the weaker characters in the film, it is still hugely interesting to see how and where Johnny Depp got his start before becoming one of the biggest names in Hollywood. Ironically, even portraying Edward Scissorhands just 6 years later, yet another bladed glove character. The trio spend the night at Tina's house under the auspices of a sleepover, when Tina's boyfriend, Rod, makes an unannounced visit. Later that night, as Tina and Rod are in bed, Tina falls asleep only to find herself in yet another dream. This time, she feels something beckoning her from the outside, and is abruptly confronted by Freddy Krueger yet again. Here, Freddy exhibits some of his most ghoulish tricks seen so far, such as extending his arms outwards. Tina is ultimately killed off in a gruesome fashion which traumatizes Nancy. Nancy is horribly on edge after seeing her best friend be reduced to a bloodied mess, and is even confronted by a disturbed Rod while walking to school one day, only for Nancy's dad, a police officer, to orchestrate Rod's arrest as he gets blamed for Tina's murder. The dad is played by John Saxon, a prolific and veteran actor who notably starred alongside Bruce Lee in 1973's Enter the Dragon. Angry at her father for using her as a decoy to arrest Rod, and displeased with her mother for her excessive drinking and absent-minded nature, Nancy's misfortunes only worsen after she begins to get terrorized by nightmares of Freddy Krueger trying to kill her. Earlier in the film, Nancy repeatedly talks about a strange man in a striped sweater and a sharp glove being present in her dreams. But with Tina killed and Rod in jail, as well as the increasing danger she finds herself in every time she falls asleep, Nancy realizes that she is Freddy's next target. Because of this, Nancy begins to pull all-nighters by drinking gallons of coffee while taking pills to keep herself awake, behavior that continues for the rest of the movie. Disturbed by Tina's death and her frightening nightmares, Nancy confronts an incarcerated Rod who also mentions seeing recurring nightmares of Freddy Krueger, confirming Nancy's worst fears. Almost immediately afterwards, Rod is hanged in his jail cell by Freddy, leaving only Nancy and Glenn to fend off against him, although Glenn never really takes the situation completely seriously, which frustrates Nancy. Following Rod's death, Nancy is taken to a sleep research center, where after suffering from yet another deadly nightmare, manages to pull in Freddy's hat into the real world. This scene marks a turning point in the film, as it blurs the line between the dream world and reality, painting Freddy as a supernatural killer rather than an illusion, and suggests to Nancy that she may not be going crazy after all. After pulling in the hat and also receiving a wound from her last nightmare, Nancy's mother breaks down and tells her the story of the real Freddy Krueger, a child murderer who terrorized the population of the town, with a total number of 20 murdered children under his belt, primarily using a bladed glove to do the killings. However, after a mistake was made on his criminal paperwork, Freddy was set free to the universal dismay of the parents living on Elm Street. Out of anger and disgust, the parents of Elm Street then banded together to track Freddy down, isolate him in his boiler room, and ultimately burn him to death, only for Freddy to come back in the dreams of the teenagers living on Elm Street and exact revenge on their parents by killing them off one by one in grisly fashion. Soon, Glenn is killed off in one of the most iconic death scenes in film history, leaving Nancy alone to confront Freddy. Luckily, she prepared well ahead of time, and sets up traps across her house, as in theory, if she were to bring Freddy into the real world as she did with his hat, then the traps could injure and possibly kill him. After the highlight of the film where Nancy finally confronts Freddy and sets him on fire after bringing him into the real world, Nancy finally defeats him by simply overcoming her fear of him, stripping away his power and relevance in the waking world, thus bringing an end to Freddy Krueger's reign of terror. A Nightmare on Elm Street would go on to become an instant classic in the horror genre, and opened a fresh chapter in the history of the slasher film. Traditionally, slasher movies are defined as movies with body counts, typically involving a masked killer in a suburban or camp setting doing away with teenagers one after another. But A Nightmare on Elm Street offered a completely different concept. First, the character of Freddy Krueger was nothing like what audiences had seen previously. Before Freddy came onto the scene, audiences were already exposed to silent masked killers who hid in the shadows, as is the case of Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, or demented masked psychopaths inhabiting rural countrysides such as Leatherface. But unlike them, Freddy Krueger could actually talk, and had a witty personality, that became progressively more outlandish and comical throughout the franchise's run. To this end, Freddy is a bit more serious and intimidating in the original compared to the sequels, with the cinematography playing a great role in heightening just how creepy he is, by having his face be hidden by dark shadows and minimal lighting, which creates a creepily dark complexion, adding way more in the way of mystery to his character as a whole. Freddy also tinkers with the circumstances surrounding his victims. For instance, when Nancy tries calling Glenn to warn him that Freddy is out to get him, Freddy's tongue emerges from the phone, ultimately imitating what Glenn, her boyfriend, would do to her, applying heavy doses of psychological warfare to torment his victims. The character of Nancy Thompson, portrayed by actress Heather Langenkamp, is one of the most memorable final girl protagonists in slasher movie history and arguably the greatest. Unlike many other horror and slasher film protagonists in particular, Nancy is strong-willed and determined from the beginning. Rather than retreating into greater social isolation or growing irreversibly weak after seeing Tina's lifeless body or Rod's corpse in his jail cell, Nancy only becomes even more motivated to protect herself and also to finally understand the truth behind Freddy Krueger. Such a motivation would lead Nancy to inventing elaborate schemes to bring an end to Freddy, with varying success throughout the film. Notably, Nancy's ironclad determination would cause her to set up the traps intended for Freddy in the first place, making her the only one who truly stands up to Freddy, as well as the only one who can possibly bring an end to him. Heather Langenkamp would later go on to reprise her role as Nancy in A Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors, and would return to the franchise to play herself in the meta-horror masterpiece New Nightmare in 1994. Aside from the witty and different nature of Freddy Krueger as a slasher villain and horror icon, the true genius of the film goes back to its very premise. The idea of a killer entering into people's dreams and killing them in said dreams, causing them to die in real life. Such a horror serves as the crux of the horror and scares in the film, since when are you more vulnerable than when you are asleep? When asleep, it becomes impossible to defend yourself, and since sleep implies a sense of comfort and security, getting killed would be one of the last things one would associate with sleep. Shockingly, the film itself is actually based on a series of true stories that concern very similar subject matter. While piecing together the film's storyline in 1981, director Wes Craven had been toying with the idea of a bizarre killer stalking victims in their dreams for years, before he began stumbling upon eerie articles published by the Los Angeles Times. Throughout the early to mid-80s, the LA Times ran a series of articles describing a number of mysterious deaths plaguing the Southeast Asian community in the United States, in which otherwise healthy people, and especially young men, would report experiencing horrific nightmares that would keep them awake for days before finally dying in their beds after going to sleep. The majority of the victims stemmed from the Hmong community, an ethnic group that had fled to Vietnam and Laos, from China and later to the United States, following the end of the Vietnam War. The Hmong population would endure endless horrors throughout the conflict, prompting their hasty exit from the region, yet such horrors clearly did not end despite calling a new continent their home. Between July of 1977 and October of 1981, 37 people had been killed due to the unexplained nightmare condition, striking each victim quickly and without warning as they rested. By the end of the 1980s, an estimated 117 people would die in one of the oddest outbreaks in medical history. Creepily, no autopsy or investigation could determine a valid cause of death for any of the cases, though some causes have been speculated. Given the intense hardships and terror faced by such a community throughout the Vietnam War, as well as rampant persecution, the cases could be correlated with immense shock and stress embedded deeply in the mind, whereas other theories suggest that the fatal nightmare outbreak could be linked to chemical weapons used during the war. In this sense, these cases would allow for the film to be slightly based on reality, as they gave a real-life example of how the line between sleep and death could become so fragile. How even in a state of rest, the inevitability of death still persists. Wes Craven's deep intrigue pertaining to the articles would help mold a titanic classic in the horror genre, but the film holds more than a connection to real cases involving people dying in their sleep as its inspiration. According to the creators of the film, Freddy symbolizes an especially dark time in American history. November 22, 1963 will forever be known as the day in which President John F. Kennedy's life would be cut short by assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, an assassination that would forever change the course of American history and would swiftly bring an end to the innocence and stability enjoyed by American society in the years before it, paving the way for social unrest as well as American entanglement in the Vietnam War, the same conflict at the heart of the disturbing articles written by the LA Times and other publications. In short, Kennedy was assassinated on Elm Street in Dallas, Texas, a fact that directly inspired the film's title and the franchise's core setting. As a result, Freddy Krueger is symbolic of how darkness can strike a seemingly idyllic and peaceful atmosphere, causing a reign of terror on a street that would be the last place one would think of when thinking of words such as danger or even horror, a place of comfort and serenity, away from the horrors and terror of the quote-unquote real world, only terrorized by a killer who enters dreams and one that is practically inescapable. By and large, the terrifying genius of A Nightmare on Elm Street exists in its chilling symbolism and haunting subject matter, deriving from actual cases that continue to baffle the public today. Going back to Freddy Krueger, much of what makes the character so incredible is the actor portraying him, Robert Englund, who, unlike the actors for Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers, actually accomplished the monumental task of playing the character consistently for 8 straight movies up to 2003's Freddy vs. Jason, in which Freddy goes head-to-head against Jason Voorhees, yet another slasher and horror icon. A classically trained actor, Englund brought multiple dimensions to the character, ranging from his wittiness to a menacing smug attitude, quickly making Krueger into a fan favorite. Even after a number of sequels which took the franchise into different directions, the franchise never quite captured the darkness and creepy essence of the original. A film that, on its 40th anniversary in 2024, remains timeless and unforgettable, spawning 7 sequels, an unnecessary remake, and even a television series named Freddy's Nightmares, which actually had one episode explore Freddy's backstory in greater detail. But the original film's staying power is one that sticks with you in that even as you may think that you are safe and are about to fall asleep, someone or something could be waiting.